All right, welcome to the last video of Module 16, which is the first half of our discussion for um, human body systems. We're going to finish our discussion of human body systems next week, which is our next module or part 2 of the body system modules. In this module, we learned about the intro to body systems. We talked about the urinary system and homeostasis. We discussed the circulatory system, the respiratory system, and now we're going to look at the human reproductive system, and that's what we're going to finish with in this module. And so first, we're just going to start with male reproductive anatomy. For male reproduction, we have this image here that we're going to kind of work through. Okay, so for male reproduction, we have the gametes, right? And the gametes are what fertilizes the egg that is in females and leads to an embryo. Now, the sperm are formed with the testes. Okay, so the testes are what produce that sperm. The testes are made up of a scrotum, which is a sac of skin and smooth muscle that basically holds the testes. And one really important factor or fact about the scrotum is that sperm can't develop properly at our body temperature. And so the scrotum holds the testes away from the body and helps to keep the testes at a slightly lower temperature than our internal body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. And that temperature has to be lower in order for sperm to develop properly. And so that's a really big factor into why our testes are developed the way they are. Within the testes, there are seminiferous tubules, and the sperm are actually developed within the walls of the seminiferous tubules. And we have a whole figure and slide that we're going to look at that goes over the development of sperm. Now, the testes are surrounded, not completely surrounded, but are connected to the epididymis and also the ductus deferens. The ductus deferens is also referred to as the vas deferens. And the epididymis and ductus deferens is where the motile, is where sperm are stored and become motile. So the epididymis is where they're stored and become motile, and then the ductus deferens transport the sperm to the ejaculatory duct, which is near the prostate gland, and that is where it kind of awaits to be released during sexual intercourse. Now, if we look at the complete route of sperm from the testes to ejaculation, you start off in the seminiferous tubules where those sperm will develop and mature. They'll be stored in the epididymis, and they'll travel from the epididymis to the duct deferens, to the ejaculatory duct, and then they will travel into the urethra through the penis and then out the urethral opening, which is shown in this figure here. Now, semen is a mixture of several secretions. You have the sperm itself, so the mature sperm, and then you have other secretions that are introduced to the sperm before it's ejaculated by several different accessory glands. Those three accessory glands are the seminal vesicles, which is right here. So right at the ejaculatory duct, or the beginning of the ejaculatory duct near the prostate gland. The prostate gland is right under that, so right under the bladder. And then the bulbourethral gland, which is this tiny gland down here underneath the prostate. Now, each of these glands release specific secretions that are important for the nourishment of the sperm and the traveling of the sperm through the urethra. The seminal vesicles actually secrete a carbohydrate. They secrete fructose, which is a source of energy for the sperm. And then the prostate gland actually secretes this alkaline fluid that helps to raise the vaginal pH so that it can receive the sperm appropriately. And then the bulbourethral gland secretes a lubricating mucus and also a material that is used to kind of cleanse the urethra, to kind of wash it out of any remaining urine, or just making sure that it's clean for the sperm to travel through. And so the semen that male ejaculates during sexual intercourse is made up of all of those secretions that come from those three accessory organs or accessory glands, and the sperm itself. Okay. And so if we look at kind of an overview of the male reproductive anatomy, we have this table here. So there are two testes, and again, those two testes produce sperm as well as testosterone and inhibin. And we'll talk about testosterone and inhibin in a few minutes. You have the scrotum, which holds the testes, keeps them at the proper temperature. You have the epididymis. There's two, one at each testes, and that's the site of sperm storage and maturation. You have your duct deferens, so you have two. That's traveling from each testes. So the duct for sperm maturation again, and then storage, and then also for transport to the ejaculatory duct, right? And so the sperm are just waiting in the epididymis and the duct deferens for ejaculation, and then it will travel, right? And so during the during ejaculation, the duct is transporting that sperm and the granular secretions that will then leave the penis during sexual intercourse. And then you have the two accessory glands, so seminal vesicles, or you have the different accessory glands. So you have the seminal vesicles, prostate glands, and then the bulbourethral gland. Okay. Now, the way sperm develop is through the process of spermatogenesis. Okay. And spermatogenesis contains several different cell division processes. And the cell divisions are both mitosis and meiosis. And this process happens in the seminiferous tubules that are within the testes. And again, this is where the sperm are produced, and then they will go to the epididymis later to mature. All of these cell divisions end up producing a very large amount of sperm that have half the number of chromosomes than the regular somatic cells within our body. And we talked a lot about this during the cellular division module, where we talked about mitosis and meiosis. And then, so the sperm and the eggs are referred to as gametes. And like we said, they're haploid. So you have your gametic cells, which are the sperm and the eggs, and then your somatic cells, which are all of the other cells in your body. Now, there are a sequence of cell types that exist during the process of sperm production, right? So leading to that sperm, that mature sperm. So first you have spermatogonia, which are diploid. Mitosis will happen and you have a primary spermicide. After that, the primary spermicide then undergoes meiosis, and it forms a secondary spermicide. That will undergo the second division of meiosis and form a spermatid. And then that spermatid will mature into a mature sperm cell after it goes to the epididymis and matures. There are also serotoli cells that are present in the seminiferous tubules that provide nourishment for these developing cells. And we're going to show all of that in this figure here. All right, so here we have The testes, we have the scrotum, we have the vesicles that lead to the blood supply. You have your epididymis here. You have your ductus deferens that's running from that up to the ejaculatory duct. And then in here, you have your testes, a cross section of your testis with all of the seminiferous tubules coiled inside. And so if we uncoil one of those seminiferous tubules and look at a cross section and zoom in kind of on the edge of that tubule, this is what we would see. Here's your spermatogonium, right? This is the first stage. That undergoes mitosis to produce a primary spermacide. Then your primary spermacide undergoes meiosis. So the first division phase in meiosis, remember there's 2 division phases. That first division phase produces secondary spermacides. Then your last meiosis division phase produces your early spermatids. And then those will develop into late spermatids. And then they will develop into immature sperm. So your first step of meiosis makes the haploid spermacide. So that secondary spermacide is your first haploid cell in this process. Up until then, the primary spermacide and the spermatogonium are diploid. Okay, so haploid after this point. And so your immature sperm is haploid. That will then travel to the epididymis and the ductus deferens or vas deferens to mature and then move to the ejaculatory duct when it's ready to be released. Now here's an actual cross section of the tubules, and you can see those cells that are being made and produced. Now, if we look at a sperm cell, there are a couple of different pieces to a sperm cell itself. You have the head of the sperm, which contains the male's chromosomes and also an acrosome. This contains enzymes that help the sperm fertilize the egg. It helps the sperm get to the egg and fertilize it. The mid piece, which is this area here, contains mitochondria that produce energy for the sperm to function. And then the flagella is what causes the sperm to swim to the fallopian tube where it will fertilize the egg during intercourse. Okay. Now, we also mentioned that the testes not only create sperm, but they also release testosterone. Testosterone is a steroid hormone that's produced by interstitial cells in the testes. So these cells are between the seminiferous tubules. So right in here. Right, so here's a tubule, and then you have these cells in between. Those are the interstitial cells. So right here's a tubule, there's the bottom of the tubule, another tubule. So all of this kind of yellowish cells, that's your interstitial cells. That is where the testosterone is produced. The function of that testosterone hormone is to control the growth and function of male reproductive tissues. It stimulates aggression in males and also stimulates sexual behavior. It controls the development of secondary sexual characteristics. And it also determines the rate of sperm formation within the seminiferous tubules. Now, there are hormones that regulate the production of testosterone and the production of sperm. These hormones are, the first one we're going to learn about is called gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. This hormone comes from the hypothalamus, okay? And that hypothalamus, which is in the brain, stimulates the release of LH and FH hormones. These hormones come from the pituitary gland, which is also located in the brain. The LH hormone stimulates the production of testosterone. The FSH hormone enhances sperm formation. Okay. And that sperm, remember, forms with the serotoli cells that provide nourishment for that for the developing sperm. Now, the serotoli cells will create inhibin, and inhibin, when it's secreted, inhibits the production of FSH. And so we have a feedback loop here, a negative feedback loop that is making sure that there's a constant blood concentration of testosterone. And this figure will kind of show you how it works. So we have our hypothalamus secreting the GnRH. That goes to the pituitary that tells it to secrete LH and FSH. LH will then tell the interstitial cells to produce testosterone. FSH will tell the serotoli cells to produce inhibin and stimulate sperm production. Okay. The presence of testosterone also tells the serotoli cells to produce sperm. Now, after the sperm is being produced and the inhibin is produced, the inhibin will inhibit the secretion of GnRH and FSH, as will the presence of testosterone. So it inhibits the secretion of GnRH and LH, right? So testosterone is tied to LH and GnRH. Inhibin is tied to GnRH and FSH, okay? So when you have an ample production of sperm and testosterone, that will turn off the production of the GnRH hormone and turn off the production of the LH and FSH. When testosterone levels get low, sperm levels start to decrease and inhibin starts to decrease. Then the testosterone won't be there to cut off GnRH, and so GnRH will be produced, and then the cycle will continue, right? So you have this negative feedback loop that's directly controlling the amount of testosterone and sperm cells that are present in the male reproductive system. Okay. And so next, we're going to go from the male reproductive system to the female reproductive system. And the female reproductive system is there to produce eggs and to support pregnancy. So the eggs will be fertilized by the sperm in reproduction, and then the growing embryo and fetus will be supported by the female reproductive system during pregnancy until birth. Okay. So the female reproductive system, it contains ovaries, which release oocytes, and these oocytes are immature eggs. Ovaries will also secrete hormones that are really important for regulating what the female reproductive system does at each kind of stage of the egg release and travel of the egg throughout the reproductive system and pregnancy. Now, the hormones that the ovaries release are estrogen and progesterone, and we'll talk more about these two hormones in a little bit. Now, the oviduct, which is also the fallopian tube, travels from the ovary to the uterus, okay? And fertilization actually occurs in the upper third of the oviduct, so closest to the ovary in the upper third area. And it generally takes about 3 to 4 days for an egg to go from the oviduct to the uterus, okay? And the uterus is in kind of the lower portion of the reproductive system, and it's this hollow pear-shaped organ where a fertilized egg will implant, grow, and develop during pregnancy. The uterus has 3 different tissue layers, or 3 different layers, I should say. It has an endometrium, a myometrium, and a cervix. Okay? The endometrium is the tissue that's supporting a fertilized egg. And during menstruation, this is what is being discarded from your body. Um, and so whenever you are bleeding, it's basically the endometrium that's coming out of your reproductive system. So it kind of sloughs off during menstrual flow. The myometrium is a smooth muscle that basically grows during pregnancy. It expands during pregnancy, and it causes the contractions during labor. So that's the myometrium that's contracting. Then the cervix is at the lower part of the uterus, and it's this small opening that allows the sperm to go into the uterus and also allows the fetus to exit during birth. And so when the fetus exits, that cervix will be stretched. And that's what the doctors are measuring whenever they're measuring how many centimeters a female is dilated during birth. They're measuring the opening of the cervix. Then at the lower portion of the uterus, you have the vagina, which is the organ of sexual intercourse, and the birth canal. Okay. And then you have the external genitalia, which is the labia majora and the labia minora, and then also the clitoris. Okay. So we have a figure here that's going through all of those different structures that we just discussed. So this figure on the top kind of goes through all of them at once, shows a whole kind of image, including the urinary system. This image, we're just looking at the reproductive system itself. So you have your two ovaries, you have your oviduct, and then your oviducts kind of go around these ovaries with these little projections. They kind of look like fingers. They're called fimbriae, right? And so the oviduct connects the ovary to the uterus. And then you have your uterus here. And then that outer layer is the endometrium. That inner smooth muscle layer is the myometrium. So you can see that here in myometrium. That pinkish layer here is the endometrium. You have your cervix, which is this opening here. And then this is the vagina. Okay. And then on the exterior, you have your majora labia, which is on the outside. And you have your labium minora, which is interior. And then your clitoris up at the top portion of the labium minora. Okay. And so you'll want to memorize all of these parts for both the male and the female reproductive systems, and make sure you can identify them either in this orientation or the orientation like you see up in the top here. Okay. And so just to kind of orient you on this, ovary, oviduct, fimbriae, right? You have your uterus, the pink layer. Here's the endometrium, the thicker layers, the myometrium, cervix opening, your vaginal canal, right? And then the labium minora, and then the labium majora, okay? And then your clitoris right up there, right? And then reference that with the urinary system. The bladder is right next to the uterus with the urethra, okay? And then we also have a table that is just like the male reproductive system table, where we look at all of the structures that we've mentioned and then the function of those structures as well. Okay. Now, with the female reproductive system, we mentioned that it develops and releases the eggs, and it also is where the pregnancy the embryo develops during pregnancy. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these cycles and patterns. Now, the menstrual cycle is made up of the ovarian and the uterine cycles. And these cycle approximately every 28 days. Now, every female can be different in terms of timing, depending on how their hormones are, etc., right? And on average, though, it's approximately every 28 days. And these cycles are controlled by hormones that are produced in the pituitary glands and the ovaries. Okay, so like the FSH, the LH, estrogen, progesterone, all of these hormones are going to be controlling and regulating the cycling and the timing of all the steps that happen within the menstrual cycle. Now, the menstrual cycle begins at puberty, so basically maturation of a female, and then continues until menopause. And the only time it stops is during pregnancy. So between puberty and menopause, your menstrual cycle only ceases whenever the individual is pregnant. Now, like we mentioned, the menstrual cycle is made up of two cycles that are linked together, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. The ovarian cycle is where you have changes in your ovaries that are associated with the maturation of the oocyte or the egg. And that ovarian cycle is controlled by the same two hormones that we talked about in the males, so FSH and LH. Okay. The uterine cycle is the development and changing of the endometrial lining in the uterus. And so it basically determines when the uterine lining sheds and when it grows. And that is regulated by estrogen and progesterone. Okay. And so looking at first the ovarian cycle, right? In the ovarian cycle, the oocytes mature and then they are released and travel through the oviduct. Okay. So you have an immature follicle of what's called a primary oocyte and a granulosa cell to develop. As these are developing, you get an increase in FSH and LH production. Okay. The granulosa cell will divide and it will produce what's called a zona pellucida, which grows around the developing oocyte. And I have images in the next slide that can help you visualize this. Then you have what's called an antrum to develop within a follicle. And then you have some estrogen and progesterone hormones that will be secreted. Okay. Then you have a secondary oocyte and a polar body that are produced. Okay. So then you get your follicle to mature here, right? And once this happens, you get increased estrogen, which causes a big surge in the LH hormone, and that causes the release of the secondary oocyte and ovulation. So ovulation happens when that LH hormone increases, causing the follicle to rupture and release that secondary oocyte. That follicle, the remnants of that follicle will form what's called the corpus luteum. And then large amounts of estrogen and progesterone are secreted into the reproductive system. Okay. And so all of this is happening within the ovary. Okay. And so we got an image to kind of help visualize this. So we're just looking at one ovary, which is shown here. So we're zooming into one ovary. And each of these steps are happening for each developing oocyte. So first, you have your primary oocyte with those granulosa cells starting to grow around it. Okay. Development begins. You get that increase in stimulation of FSH, and those granulosa cells start to divide and start surrounding that primary oocyte. Okay. Then you get a fluid-filled antrum to develop, and a follicle begins to produce estrogen. Okay. And so the follicle is this pinkish material that is surrounding those granulosa cells. Okay. Now here you have a secondary oocyte, you have your granulosa cells, you have your follicle, you have your antrum developed, okay? And that follicle is basically matured. Okay, it's maturing, you're getting estrogen secretion, and then eventually you'll get an increase in LH, causing that follicle that's holding that oocyte, the secondary oocyte, to rupture, releasing that secondary oocyte into the fallopian tubes. Then that follicle will remain and produce progesterone. Okay, that follicle will not, the follicle will develop into the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum will produce the progesterone. That will remain if pregnancy happens. So if the egg is fertilized, that corpus luteum will continue to produce. If pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum will degenerate. Okay. So when fertilization occurs and pregnancy occurs, the embryonic tissue that develops from the fertilized egg, the chorion, will secrete what's called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. So whenever your doctor determines if you're pregnant or you take a pregnancy test, they're specifically testing for the presence of HCG, because the only way the HCG is made is if an embryonic tissue is present. And so the HCG causes the corpus luteum to continue to produce estrogen and progesterone for approximately 3 months. So about 9 to 10 weeks, little less than 3 months. After 9 to 10 weeks, the developed placenta will take over the progesterone and estrogen production, and the corpus luteum won't be needed to generate those hormones anymore. Now, the presence of estrogen and progesterone is what prevents ovulation from happening during pregnancy. So those high levels of estrogen and progesterone basically prevent the ovarian cycle. Okay. Now, the uterine cycle actually prepares the uterus for pregnancy and gets it ready to accept the fertilized egg. Okay. So the uterine cycle is made up of a couple of different phases. It's made up of 4 different phases. You have the menstrual phase, which is approximately days 1 through 5. So during these phases, your estrogen and progesterone decrease in concentration. The endometrial lining on the uterus degenerates and menstruation occurs. Okay, so you release that endometrial lining. After that, between days 6 and 14, you have what's called a proliferative phase. You have an increased production in estrogen and progesterone. Your endometrial lining will thicken and it will proliferate. And then around day 14, that's when ovulation happens. That's when the secondary oocyte will be released. Ovulation occurs. And then remember, it takes approximately 3 or 4 days for that oocyte to travel into the uterus. Okay. And so days 15 and 28, the corpus luteum will continue to produce your progesterone and estrogen. The endometrium continues to proliferate and thicken. Your uterine glands will mature. And then the uterus is prepared to accept and nourish a fertilized egg. So if fertilization occurs, the egg will implant and gestation will happen. Embryonic development will happen. If there is no fertilized egg, your estrogen and progesterone will decrease, the endometrial lining will degenerate, and then your menstruation will happen, and then you'll continue the the uterine cycle. Okay, so that uterine cycle is prepping the uterus to get ready to accept a fertilized egg if it's there. Okay. Now there are changes in hormone levels that actually cause that menstrual cycle to happen. So the hormones of the pituitary gland and reproductive structures cause a positive feedback and a negative feedback in the female reproductive system. So during the proliferative phase, right, you have an increase in estrogen, which causes that surge in LH. And that surge in LH causes ovulation, right? So you have estrogen that produces LH, which produces the estrogen to produce the LH, right? It causes that ovulation to happen. So you get a positive feedback mechanism going, and the only way to end it is for ovulation to happen, okay? The negative feedback stage is in the secretory phase. This is where your levels of estrogen and progesterone inhibit the production of LH and FSH. And so the presence of these determine, right, whether or not the ovulation is going to happen. So if, right, fertilization happens, progesterone and estrogen continue. But if fertilization doesn't happen, they're not there, and so LH and FSH can be released, and ovulation happens, right? But if fertilization happens, then you get increased progesterone and estrogen to occur, therefore creating that negative feedback loop, okay? And so that's it for this video. That's the reproductive systems of males and females. So make sure you can go through all of the figures that we looked at and talk about LH and FSH and testosterone and estrogen and progesterone and how they're related in each of the reproductive systems. And yeah, so with that does it for module 16. We'll pick up with body systems in next week's module, which is module 17. And yeah, so that's it for this video. Have a good day, and we'll see you in the next module.